My son never bought flowers, never bought a diamond ring. He went to a mechanic's shop and welded 2 extra wheels onto a bicycle. And that was the first time I ever saw my daughter-in-law cry from happiness. Hello everyone, how are you doing today? Wishing you all a peaceful and wonderful day. I am Jack's mother. People often ask me, "Oh, your son is an engineer, a director no less. You must be so proud." I just smile. My pride doesn't come from what he's achieved or how much he earns. It comes from knowing that I raised a man who understands how to love. I remember that morning so clearly. The air was still cool, and the morning dew hadn't quite lifted from the vegetable rows out in the garden. Jack finished his breakfast, turned to me, and said quietly, "Mum, I'm going out for a bit. I want to get something for Tutienne." I asked what. He just smiled and said, "It's a surprise. Wait till I'm back." I wasn't surprised by his secrecy. Jack has always been this way. A boy of few words, but everything he does is thoughtful down to the very last detail. His old friends used to tease him for being boring, saying he had no sense of romance. I always found that a little amusing. His kind of romance is just different. Not red roses. Not candlelit dinners. Jack's romance is spending an entire evening quietly thinking about what the person he loves might need, what she's missing, what small weight she's been carrying alone. And Tutienne, my daughter-in-law, she had been carrying quite a lot. She was orphaned young. Growing up, there was no one to teach her the ordinary things other children simply learn along the way. Riding a bicycle, for instance. It might sound like a small thing, but out here in the countryside, not knowing how to ride is a real hardship. To go to the market, she walks. To check on the fields, she walks. Through the midday heat, through the afternoon rain, her feet bear it all. I wanted so much to help, but I'm too old to teach her myself, and I didn't know how else to make it easier. Jack knew. He had known for a long time. He was simply waiting for the right moment. That morning was the moment. I stood on the porch and watched him walk out through the gate. And something warm settled in my chest. I couldn't explain it, just a quiet feeling that something beautiful was about to happen. While Jack was away, Tutienne didn't sit still for a moment. She never does. She was up at dawn to light the stove, soaking glutinous rice from the night before, carefully filling each small sticky rice cake with sweet raisins, her hands moving with the kind of patience that can't be taught. I watched her from across the room and thought, this girl. Life gave her so little, and yet somehow it gave her the most golden pair of hands. When the cakes were done, she packed them neatly into a basket, put on her conical hat, and headed off to the market to sell them. I called after her. "Do you need me to come along?" She shook her head and smiled gently. "No, Mum, it's all right." I'm used to it. I watched her small figure disappear down the road, hat bobbing in the light, and felt a quiet ache in my heart. She was so used to managing things on her own, that was the thing I admired most about her, and the thing that made me ache for her most deeply. She came back not long after. The basket was empty. Her cheeks were flushed from the sun, but her eyes were absolutely radiant. The way eyes look when something small and good has happened, and the heart hasn't quite caught up yet. She told me with barely contained excitement, "Mum, I sold everything. People kept coming back, and a few ladies even asked if I'd be there again next week." I laughed and nodded. "Of course they did. Your cakes are wonderful, my dear." She sat down on the front step, slipped off her sandals, and rubbed her tired feet. I looked at her and felt that familiar ache again. The market isn't close. Walking there and back in the noon heat, those feet of hers had carried far too much for far too long. If only she had a bicycle. And right at that moment, I heard the sound of wheels rolling up outside the gate. Jack was home. What he wheeled in, none of us could have anticipated. It was a bicycle, but not an ordinary one. Along the back, where a normal bike would have only 2 wheels, there were 2 iron bars welded outward on either side, and attached to each bar was a small, sturdy, extra wheel, sitting flat against the ground. The whole thing looked a little funny, a little cobbled together, and yet It was the most heartbreaking thing I had ever seen, in the very best way. Tutienne stood there, completely still, staring at it. I stood there too, just the same. Jack wheeled it calmly into the yard, looked at Tutienne and smiled. I heard you never learned to ride because you were scared of falling. On this one, you won't fall. I turned my face away because my eyes had suddenly gone warm. I have been Jack's mother for over 40 years. I know my son from the days when he was just a small boy who cried every time there was a thunderstorm. I know the way he looks at the people he loves. Never showy, never dramatic, just a quiet, steady gaze that says, I'm here and I've got this. I also know the way he carries sadness. Sitting alone on the porch, not complaining, not explaining, just looking out at the distance. But that afternoon, I saw a Jack I hadn't seen before. A Jack standing in the middle of the farmyard, eyes bright, patiently guiding a young woman's hands onto the bicycle's handlebars. His voice, I was struck by how soft it was. How careful. As though speaking even a little too loudly might startle her into giving up before she'd truly begun. Look straight ahead. Don't look down at your feet. Just pedal. The extra wheels will keep you steady. I promise you won't fall. Tutienne shook her head. I'm really scared, Jack, he smiled. That's okay. Be scared and pedal anyway. Can you do that? I stayed leaning against the porch post, not daring to come any closer. I didn't want to disturb what was unfolding in front of me, so I just watched. I watched Tutienne grip the handlebars, watched her trembling feet find the pedals, and then, slowly, push. The wheels turned. She let out a small yelp, but the bicycle didn't fall. Those two little extra wheels held her, steady and sure, just as Jack's hands had held her so many times before. And then, I couldn't tell you exactly when it happened, she began to truly pedal. The bike rolled forward, slow at first, then a little faster, then faster still. Her laughter filled the yard. Not a polite laugh, not a performative one. It was the laughter of someone who, perhaps for the first time in a very long while, felt genuinely held, cared for in a way that reached all the way down to the small, specific details of her life. It was clear and bright and free, rising up past the longan trees at the far edge of the garden. I pressed my lips together because I knew Tutienne had not had many moments like this in her life. She lost her parents when she was very young. She grew up quietly, bearing whatever came her way. Her first marriage brought her into a household where she was taken advantage of, never truly welcomed. Then came the accident, engineered by someone carrying a grudge against Jack, that left her without her memories for a time. That gentle, resilient mind of hers had weathered so much hurt, and so few people had ever simply held her and said, it's all right. I'm here now, until Jack. My son is not perfect. He's busy, he sometimes struggles to find the right words, and he can be clumsy in the way that men often are. But he loves through action. Every time Tutienne needed something, even when she hadn't said a word about it, Jack felt it and quietly made it right. That's not a natural talent. That is love. Real and unhurried. The kind that doesn't need an audience. I was still lost in thought when Tutienne suddenly called out across the yard. Jack, come sit behind me. I'll give you a ride. I looked up and laughed out loud. There she was, pedaling in wide circles around the yard, cheeks rosy, hair coming loose, eyes absolutely gleaming. Jack stood with his arms folded, wearing an expression of theatrical skepticism. Are you sure? If we fall, I'm not catching us. We won't fall. You welded those wheels on tight yourself, remember? And so Jack climbed on behind her. This engineer, this director, this son of mine who works himself half to death, sitting somewhat precariously on the back of a bicycle, letting this small, soft-spoken young woman who was carrying their first child pedal them both around the farm. They laughed until their sides hurt, and I laughed too, laughed with tears streaming quietly down my face. Not from sadness, from relief. the deep exhaled relief of a mother who has worried and watched and hoped for so many years and who finally, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, sees her child truly happy. Not the kind of happy you show people. The kind you live, quietly, in your own yard, with the sound of bicycle wheels on earth and the laughter of two people who have forgotten, just for this moment, everything that has ever been hard. That evening, Jack took out his flute and played for Tu Tien. The melody was simple, folksy, a little uneven. He'd been out of practice for a while and missed a beat or two along the way. But Tuttienne sat beside him, with her eyes closed, smiling softly, as though she were listening to the most beautiful music she had ever heard. Jack apologized for being rusty. Tuttienne shook her head gently.
I like it just like this.
As long as you're the one playing, that's enough for me. I stood in the kitchen, a pair of chopsticks forgotten in my hand, the vegetables cooling in the wok, just listening to that melody drift in through the open door. And my heart went still in the quietest, most peaceful way.
I want to be honest with you about where this story comes from. I didn't witness this moment from the inside. I came to know them the way an outsider sometimes stumbles into something tender. Through a conversation, a quiet afternoon, a cup of tea, and a moment who had clearly been waiting for someone to ask. That's I met her, Jack's mother, and once she started talking, she didn't stop, not because she had no filter, but because she simply had so much to love to give, and no better way to give it than through words.
She told me about the bicycle, the way people tell stories they are afraid of forgetting. She told me about Tu Tien's laughter, Jack's flute, the tears she cried standing in the kitchen. And when she finished, she looked at me and said simply, "A good man doesn't need to move mountains. He just needs to weld on 2 extra wheels and run alongside." I've been thinking about that ever since.